American poet Maria Mazziotti Gillan is with me today in her office. And before we start and talk about her work, her books, I will video record her paintings. You told me that you restarted painting.
I painted when I was a young woman, when my children were young. And then maybe 10 years ago, I was on a reading tour with Diane DePrima, and we started in San Francisco, where Diane lives. And then as we were leaving San Francisco, she said, let's stop at an art supply store, and you need to start painting again. I don't know what gave her the idea, but anyway, so we drove to Santa Cruz where we had readings, and we went to a motel, and she went in her room and I went in my room, and she said, okay, now paint. And I got in there and I looked outside the window and there were roses growing outside the window. So I started trying to paint roses, and I couldn't paint the roses. I couldn't make a rose that really looked like a rose. And I started ripping up papers, and I'm thinking, oh, what am I going to have for Diane? It'll be so embarrassing. I can't do anything. And then I thought, stop. What do you tell your students? Let go. Stop worrying about making a perfect rose and make Maria's rose. And so that's what I did. And I'm having such a wonderful time with the painting. They're primitive. I have no art training at all.
We were talking about your
the
rose, the Maria Mazziotti Gillan rose.
The Maria Mazziotti Gillan rose was horrible, so I ripped up the pages and I kept crumpling them up and throwing them in the garbage. And then I thought, what do you always tell your students? Let go. Let the old lady who lives in your belly, who's wiser than all brains, just take over. And that's what I did. And I started painting, and I found it so wonderful because it uses a whole other part of my brain that I don't use when I'm writing or teaching. And so it was extremely relaxing. I actually had two art exhibits out in California, and people have purchased my paintings. It's been great fun. I'm having a wonderful time with it. It's been another source of creativity for me,
and
it's a way for me to express a different part of myself. In a way, I think my art is happier looking than some of my poems. But I think in general in my poems I end on a positive note. My mother wouldn't have expected anything less. She didn't allow you to moan. If you fell on the floor with a broken leg, she said, get up, you can do it, it's all in your mind. So in a way, the art is like that for me.
I see primarily women in your...
Yeah, I have a compulsion to draw women, probably because I can't draw men. Maybe that's the reason. It's like the rose. It's hard for me to draw a man.
And what did you use? What kind of...
Usually watercolors, which is what Diane had gotten me to buy in San Francisco. And then I started doing, adding pieces of collage and things like that, because I wanted to make it be more textured and layered. But for me, a lot of this is a very relaxing, I lead a very, very busy life, to say the least. And so, for me, this was a way of balancing out my busyness. Because when I'm doing the painting, I'm not thinking about anything except letting go and letting the paint go where it wants to go.
This is a collage that I'm looking at right now, with the two girls.
I can't hear you, honey.
The one right here, it's a collage.
Yes.
It's a collage.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
And this one is a collage too. And it's interesting that when I was in San Francisco, I ended up drawing a lot of people that look Japanese. I was staying at a Japanese hotel. So I did this one in San Francisco, this one over here. The middle one is mine. And when I was in San Francisco, you see, they look sort of Japanese. It was really weird. So I did a whole bunch of paintings with people who kind of look Japanese. That's Diane DePrima's watercolor. And this is a painting that somebody did for me based on a poem of mine called "Watching the Pelican Die." This big painting, "Watching the Pelican Die." That's
You have a poem, Watching the Pelicans Die.
yeah. I have a poem called "Watching the Pelican
Regarding
Die."
the oil spill, about the oil
Well, it
spill.
was regarding the oil spill, but I have to say that it came about because my husband died in 2010, and when he was dying, his hands turned black at the tips, and it was such a horrible death. It was a really horrible, horrible death, I have to say. And I couldn't really confront it. And at the same time, the oil spill was going on. So the two things kind of got mixed up in my mind. And I've been doing that more and more, mixing environmental issues with my grief over my husband and my feeling that individual grief can be coupled with grief for what we've done to the world. And I think we've done some pretty awful things to the world. And so, to the natural world, I mean. So anyway, I'm glad I started painting again. It's been fun. It's been fun to do. I realize I'm very honest about my own work. I know I'm not a genius artist, but it's a wonderful, wonderfully relaxing kind of thing for me to do. And I love the fact that I can almost feel it using a different part of my brain.
We have a few of your books here. You wrote 15 books.
15 books. Two have been translated into Italian, Luce d'Inverno and Talismani, which is over there. And that won the American Literary Translators Award in 1988, I think.
I'm just going to let the people know that Luce d'Inverno means winter light.
It means winter light, and it's a translation of the poems in Winter Light. And
are you happy with the translation?
Oh yes, very much so. And I went on a 10-day reading tour of Italy. The translators set it up, and we read in. I read one poem in Italian, and they read my poems in Italian. I read one poem in English, and they read my poems in Italian because I speak Italian, but it's a dialect of Italian rather than standard Italian. I never took Italian in school. I took French. And the reason I did that is that when I went to school a long time ago, you were not permitted to have as your language Italian. You had to, if you were going to college, you had to take French or German. So I took French. And it was totally useless since I can't say one word in French, but I can read French. I did pass a PhD exam in French, but I also passed a PhD exam in Italian by looking at the Italian and sounding it out until I could figure out what the word was. That's the way I read Italian. My Italian is not, it's really a peasant's Italian, I have to say. It's a dialect that's probably 100 years out of date. And Italians, when they came here to America, I don't know if this happened in Canada, but when they came here from America, they usually went to little communities where there were lots of other people from their region of Italy, and when they tried to learn English, they often took an English word and put an A at the end of it. So what ended up happening was that for their children, we often didn't know that the word was not an Italian word. It certainly wasn't an English word. My mother would try to say the book in English, and she would say bocca. I thought bocca was the Italian word for book. I never studied it in school, so I had no idea. So for years, and there are a lot of Italians of my who are second generation Italians. My parents were born in Italy. I was born in the United States, but I didn't speak English when I went to school. And so I was raised in a household where my parents spoke this dialect, a Southern Italian dialect, a Cilentano dialect. And basically that's the dialect I learned. And I never actually studied it in school. My sister was in the commercial course, and she was going to be a secretary. So she was allowed to take Italian because she wasn't going to college. and it served her in very good stead. My brother's a doctor. My sister was his translator. Not only was she his nurse, because she went back to school after and got a BS in nursing, but she was his nurse in his office, and she also translated what he said to patients who only spoke Italian. So she was very helpful to him, for she was his nurse for 25 years, and she was very helpful to him. He had a very large group of people who were from Italy who spoke Italian and didn't speak English. So obviously, you go to a doctor, you need to know what the doctor said to you. So she was able to translate. A few years ago, I went to Italy, and she made me an honorary citizen of the town my mother came from, San Mauro Cilento. And you see the citizenship paper. One of my poems was used on the Italian language exam. On the Italian exam for people who were graduating from the secondary school. And the man who was the cultural minister of San Mauro wrote to me on internet and on email and said, "Listen, I see that you mentioned San Mauro in this poem. Where is this San Mauro?" And I said, "It's San Mauro Cilento, provincia di Salerno." And he said, "Oh, that's our town." And he went and he looked at my mother's birth certificate and my mother and father's marriage certificate and my grandparents' birth certificates. It was just amazing. And then he wrote to me and he said, "We'd like to honor you. We'd like to make you an honorary citizen of the town. Would you like to come, and we'll have a day in celebration of you?" And so my daughter and I went. It was so wonderful. I cannot tell you how wonderful it was. First of all, to go to the town my mother came from, which I had never seen before, and to meet first cousins I had never met, and then to have them do this elaborate, really elaborate ceremony that had all the mayor of the town and all the officials of the town, and just about every person in that town came out. They couldn't get everybody into the hall. What they did is people were standing outside the doors listening, and it was just a most wonderful, wonderful experience for me and for my daughter, I think too. And it was so fantastic to actually see the place where my mother was born and to feel so welcomed and at home there, and to feel the way poetry can bridge a lot of gaps. When I first went to Italy with my husband in 1978, we went on a tour because I knew I couldn't speak Italian correctly. And I knew I wasn't, my mother said, "Don't open your mouth when you get to Italy. They're going to know exactly where you come from, and you're going to make mistakes," which I do make a lot of mistakes when I speak Italian. I mean, I don't know, half the time I'm using an English word with an A added to the end. And so she said, "Don't say anything." So the first time my husband and I went, we went on a tour. And I didn't have the nerve to go to the town where my mother was born or anything, because it's on the top of a mountain. You'd really have to know Italian in order to be able to get there. I was afraid to drive there and all that. So this was and since then I've gone back to Italy probably maybe at least 15 or 20 times, and I've read in different places in Rome, in Florence, all over Sicily, twice all over Sicily, in Genoa, in Milan, in Padua. I don't know, I can't think of other places, Venice. So I've really, and a lot of scholars in Italy are now writing about my work, which is my mother would have been so happy, and my father would have been even happier, because my mother thought I told all my secrets and all her secrets in poems, so she didn't like anybody knowing anything about her. And but my father would have been really thrilled by the whole thing. So, and I was certainly thrilled by it.
Now let's talk about the books. We have only some of them here. We don't have them all. Right?
We don't have them all spread out, but I have 15 books of poetry, including the two translations.
This is your magazine.
This is my magazine, the Paterson Literary Review. I started it. I've been editor of it for 34 years, and I choose everything that's in the magazine. It's my magazine. It has my stamp. I choose to work in it. This is Unsettling America, and I have Growing Up Ethnic in America, Unsettling America, Identity Lessons, and Italian American Writers on New Jersey. These three, Unsettling America, Growing Up Ethnic in America, and Identity Lessons, are all from Penguin Putnam, which is a major New York publisher, and the Italian American Writers of New Jersey is from Rutgers University Press. And then I have 15 of my own books. My first book was called Flowers from the Tree of Night. And then, I could go through a whole list of names. My latest book is The Place I Call Home.
This is the latest one, yeah. I have this one. It's a beautiful book.
So that's my latest. And before that, from Guernica in Canada, they put out What We Pass On, which is my collected poems from 1980 to 2009. It actually contains all the books that Guernica published, and I had other books before that, but it contains all the books that Guernica published, and also some new poems, which are not in this book, they're in there. And then I have this coming out now, Writing Poetry to Save Your Life, which will be out early in 2013. And it's a book that's really about writing and about how I came to write. And it's a book that is intended to encourage people to find the stories they have to tell and to be brave and to find the writer inside themselves and let that person loose. And so it has prompts, but it has a lot of encouragement. Is really, I think the publisher describes it as, it's as though you're sitting with somebody at a kitchen table and the person is encouraging you and helping you to reach your potential. So that's what I'm trying to do with that book.
All That Lies Between Us, you published it?
That was published by Guernica, and it won the American Book Award, and that was in 2008. This is 2010,
so
and this came out in September 2012. Mm-hmm. That one's 85.
Where I Come From?
No, Winter Light.
Winter Lights.
Where I Come From is a selected and new poems, and that came out in, I want to say it came out in 94 from Guernica.
I would like to focus on some of the poems that you wrote in the latest book, The Place I Call Home, and What We Pass On. These are the books that I actually focused on, and I also have them. Your mother is very present in this book. In fact, I can say that she's a predominant figure in these books. What makes her so predominant? I was expecting to see more Maria Mazziotti in these books, but I'm seeing more your mother.
I think because in some ways I am my mother, if you know what I mean. There's a poem in this book called The Little General. And when we were young, my brother used to call my mother the Little General. And I was on NPR recently, and this man was interviewing me, and I suddenly realized he had me read that poem, and I thought, oh, wait a minute, my brother and I are both the Little General. We're both kind of bossy, and my mother was a little bossy. She was a major figure for me in shaping the person I am, and in really shaping my ideas about how to live your life, never giving up, not living just for yourself. My father too. My father was more out in the world. My mother was in the home. And for me, that connection between the women is very important. It's not that I'm not connected to my father, because I am. But the connection between the women, I think in a way culture is passed by women down the generations. I'm very close to my daughter. I was very close to my mother, and I didn't know my grandmother. They were poor. They couldn't go back to Italy. They left them when they were young. They left Italy when they were young, and they weren't able to go back to Italy until after their parents had died. And my brother graduated from medical school, and after he graduated from medical school, they went back to Italy for a trip but that was the first time. And so I never met my grandmother. So she was kind of blue airmail letters and the stories my mother and father told about her. For me, that connection with the past is a way of rooting myself. And that connection with my mother is a way of rooting myself. In the poem, The Little General, I talk about the way my mother was, in a way, for me, the place I call home. And what I think is interesting is that my daughter has written some memoir pieces. Although she's a scholar, she's written some memoir pieces in which she talks about going to my mother's house after school. And my mother would feed us before we went home to feed my American husband American food. My mother would feed us Italian food. And in a way, my mother was that person whose hands were always full. And I think that she very much taught me. I don't do it with food. I do it with poetry. And in building the Poetry Center and in shaping the creative writing program at Binghamton and in establishing the Binghamton Center for Writers, I've tried to do what she did: give away poetry, encourage other people to write, make space for people to showcase their own work. And that's very much, I always thought it was an Italian thing. I don't know if it really is an Italian thing, but both my parents really taught us to think about the world as a place that we had to make into a better place than what we found it, than the place we found. My mother did it in the home, inviting people in. My father did it by going out into the community and working in the community and trying to help people to. He learned how to do things like make fill out income tax forms, and so he did income tax forms for half the Italians in Paterson. For years, he did my income tax until he was 86. He could add, multiply, and divide in his head like a computer, and he couldn't understand how somebody who had gone to school for so many years couldn't do that, because he didn't have the opportunity to go to school. He worked at very menial jobs, although he was a very, very bright man. And he also loved history and loved politics. So he could read newspapers and magazines and books in English, but his spoken English was not good. He would make just the kind of mistakes I make in Italian, he would make in English. So he was never really able to get a decent job in this country, but he made up for it by being an orator, and he would go to all the Italian. There were 50 Italian societies in Paterson when I was growing up, and he was always invited to give the speeches at those societies. Even though there were people from different regions of Italy, they would ask him to come and give the speeches. He loved the Italian language. He very often taught people who were going over to Italy to study medicine. He would teach them Italian before they went over there, so that they could go there and speak enough Italian to get by in Italy and listen to the courses in Italian and be able to pass the courses. He was very much out in the world. He learned how to sell property in Italy or send for their wives and family. And he'd take people to, he wasn't afraid. He would go to the consulate in Newark and he'd take people with him and help them to do the things they had to do in legal terms with the Italian government. So he was very much out in the world and trying to make a difference politically and make a difference in the lives of the people around him. I've lived my life like that. In a way, my poems are a way of trying to save, and I mean save the way you save something in a photograph, to save the people I grew up with, to save the world I grew up in. I'm writing more and more about my husband's death and about how difficult that was. But in this book, in a way, I'm trying to memorialize my parents and my mother in particular, and to talk about those relationships in families. There are some poems in this book about my husband's death, and some poems about my son, and some poems about my daughter, but also I'm moving into the earthquake in Japan, the tsunami in Japan. But I always connect it to personal things that are happening, because I feel that that's really important to root it some way in something personal and not just make general statements about something that's going on in the world. So I'm moving, my poems are changing a little bit. But for me, this book was a way of honoring my mother, whom I was often very rude to. And so she's been dead 20 years, and I still miss her. I still sort of have little conversations with my mother, who wouldn't approve of a lot of the things I've done in my life. Going off to Yugoslavia to read, that would have been insane to her. Once she came to America in steerage, and once she got here, she never wanted to leave again. That was it. That was enough traveling for her. I've been all over the world reading my poetry. I'm sure she would not approve, but she would support me. That was the thing about my mother. When I said I wanted to be a writer, I think she thought I was crazy. I mean, we were poor, how was I going to support myself as a writer? But she saved her money from sewing coats, which is what she did in a factory, sewing coats by hand. And she went out and she spent a great deal of money for them on a Smith Corona portable typewriter in a pink case.
You have a
And she
poem
bought
about
it to
it.
me
Yes.
and bought it for me. And it was a major thing for her to do, because it was saying, even though I think you're nuts for wanting to do this, and I don't know how you're going to support yourself, and why don't you become a kindergarten teacher, she was going to support me if I wanted to do that. When I took books to the table because I couldn't stand to leave them, she would let me read at the table. I mean, I can't think of any middle class American family who would allow their kid to read at the table. But everything I wanted to do, she was behind me. And my father was behind me. I didn't realize when I was growing up, I was embarrassed. They didn't speak English correctly. They were poor. My father had a really bad limp. They didn't have good jobs. We lived in a tenement. I was embarrassed by them. And now, the more I teach upper middle class kids and upper class kids at Binghamton, I realize how lucky I was, because they were behind me every step of the way. Even when they didn't understand what I wanted to do, I knew that they loved me. And even when they thought I was completely mad, they still supported me and stood behind me. And I tried to do that with my children. I tried to be the person that was always there for them, and a person they could always turn to. And I'm trying to do it with my grandchildren, although they live in Dallas, so it's not so easy. They're far away, but I've always tried to be a presence for them. And I think the interesting thing is, my granddaughter is very artsy. Her mother's an engineer. My son is a lawyer, and they're very conservative. Very conservative, and I'm very liberal. So, but my granddaughter is very artsy, and she writes. And every time she's done something, like she did essays for her college applications, she wrote about me. If she's asked to write about the person she admires, she writes about me. If she does a book of poetry in school and she dedicates it to me. And she wrote the most wonderful poem about me coming to my house, and the kind of memory she had of that. So, that's why I think it's sort of as though women carry it on. My father was a big presence. He was kind of a dreamer, and he loved the idea that I wrote. His father wrote, and he loved the idea that I wrote. But my mother was the one we all depended on. And she was tough. She'd say, you can't lie down just because you broke your leg. Get up, to get up, keep going. You can't let anything stop you. And really, how could I, at my age? I'm not going to say what my age is, but I'm not exactly 12, and I just went on a reading tour that would have killed somebody 25 years younger. But I did. It's certainly what I tried to do with my own children, and what I do with my students for years after they're my students. One student of mine even put on her screensaver. Her screensaver was the words, "Maria says you can do it." And I love that she put that on her screensaver. So every time she opened her computer, she saw "Maria says you can do it." And that's what this book is writing poetry to save your life. Maria says you can do it. And I think that's a big part of teaching, that you open the door for people, you provide a safe place for them, and then you invite them in. And in a way, I try to do that with my poems. I try to be as clear and direct as I can be. I try to be as specific as I can be. I try not to lie in my poems. We all lie to ourselves sometimes, but I try not to do that. And I certainly try not to do that in my poems. They are naked in some ways, in a way that I would never be naked. I never tell anybody anything when I'm talking to them. But I can do it in my poems, and it's very freeing. We were raised in an Italian family where you never told the secrets outside the home, that they were family secrets that you were supposed to keep. So it's very freeing for me to be able to write a poem and tell my secrets. I might not be able to tell somebody one-on-one, but I can tell it in a poem, and it's very freeing. I have to say that there's a poem I wrote about my father that I didn't have the nerve to write until I was 50 years old. And it was about leaving him on a corner when I was 17. He was working at a factory a few blocks from here. I was on the night shift, and it was 12 o'clock at night, and it was January, and it was cold, and it was windy, and I was with my American boyfriend in a car, and when we stopped at the light, I looked over, and my father was standing on the corner. I left him there. I didn't want my American boyfriend to see my father.
Did your father know?
Excuse me?
Did your father know? Did he see you in the car?
He never said. He never said that he knew. But I was so ashamed of having done that. I couldn't write. Every time I'd think, I really need to write about that, I couldn't do it. I couldn't make myself write about it. And then when I was about 50, I finally wrote about it. And by putting it down on paper, it was like putting down a big burden that I had had all my life, that I left him there. And he would have done anything for me. He used to get up after coming home on the night shift, and he would get up after only a couple of hours sleep to come and pick me up or to drive me to school. He would have done anything for me and for my brother and sister. And I mean, that's really what my parents taught us. And only that, we had a responsibility to the world, not to live just for ourselves. I mean, my mother was very adamant about that. My father was very adamant about that. But also we knew that they would do anything for us, and always did. So it was a terrible betrayal on my part. And then I'll tell you what happened. When my son was about, I don't know, maybe he was 10 years old or maybe 9, and he was in the Cub Scouts or the Boy Scouts, and I was driving him to a meeting, and I had just had a haircut. It was the 60s, and I had gotten an afro. And when I walked in the house, my son said, "Oh my God, don't tell anyone you're my mother." And so I drive him to Boy Scouts. I spent a lot of time, as suburban mothers in America do, driving their kids to all these activities. So I drove him to the Boy Scout meeting, and I had a little Volkswagen, and he saw his friends, and he got down in the well between the seat and the front of the car, and he said, "Don't tell anybody that you're my mother. Let my friends pass. When they pass, I'll get out of the car." Like they didn't know I was his mother. I drove him everywhere. But he was embarrassed and ashamed. And I wrote a poem about that moment, coming back to the times that I betrayed my father, because I was ashamed of him, because I was embarrassed by him. And then I realized that everybody finds their parents embarrassing. I thought because we were middle-class people and educated people, and because my husband wore a suit to work and carried a briefcase, and because I carried a briefcase, that my son wouldn't be ashamed of me, and he was. And it certainly brought me back to my own moments of shame, how I wanted to be American, how much I wanted to be what I thought of as American and upper class, and how little that saves you from having your own children look at you and be embarrassed by the things you do. My son still thinks I'm horrific, too loud, too emotional, too everything. And once recently, I was on the New York Public Radio station reading a poem, and a lawyer he had dealings with called him and said, "Is your mother a poet?" And he said, "Yes." And the man said, "I'd like to buy one of her books." And my son called me and he said, "Which book would be least embarrassing for me?" I thought it was very funny. He doesn't read my poems if he can avoid them. He says they make him avoid it. He says they make him cry, and so he won't read them. But my granddaughter grabs my books as soon as they come in. And if anybody in a review dares to say one bad thing about me, my granddaughter, who is the most American-looking kid you could possibly imagine, with those long legs that I always wanted to have myself, and the blonde hair, is just infuriated that anybody would dare say one thing bad about me. So it's wonderful.
Maria Mazziotti Gillan, professor of poetry at Binghamton University, State University of New York, and at in Paterson at the community college.
Yeah, so I don't teach at the community college. I run the poetry center, which I started in 1980.
The last time we didn't have time to do too much poetry reading, so I'm hoping that this time we'll give
we
you
can get more readings. Yeah.
People want to hear you.
Oh,
Yes.
that's a nice thing. It's always good. Am I supposed to be?
You are
No.
beautiful. You're very beautiful. So, what poems did you plan to read us today?
I can start with a poem from my latest book, is The Place I Call Home. I've reached a stage in my life where I'm very prolific, I think because tempus fugit. So because I'm a little bit maybe worried, I really am very prolific. So I have this is insane, but I have this book on writing poetry is coming out in April in Canada and the United States. It's called Writing Poetry to Save Your Life, and it's a book about the process of writing, and it's intended to encourage people to write. In August, I have a book coming out from New York Quarterly Press called The Silence in the Empty House, and this is going to sound totally insane. In October, I have a book coming out from Bordighera called Ancestor's Song, which has a lot of poems about my Italian heritage in it. The Silence in the Empty House deals with losing somebody you've been married to for 46 years, and the process of meeting the person and then having a big major illness come into our lives and all of that. So and then goes into how it takes some time to get used to living in a house by yourself after you've lived in the house with your husband for so many years, and how long it takes to kind of let go of the person who's died, because you eventually have to release the person. So that's what that book is about. Anyway, this is a poem called The Little General, and it's about, I thought it was about my mother, but then I was on the National Public Radio station in Oakland, California, Berkeley, California, and the man said, "Why don't you read that poem?" And so I started to read the poem, and then I realized that my mother was a little general, but I'm a little general too, and so was my brother. It was a little disconcerting. The Little General. My brother called our mother the Little General when we were teenagers, my brother driving the car, my mother sitting next to him, her head a small dark knob barely reaching the top of the seat. My bossy mother who told us how to live our lives, my mother who was always moving. When I remember her, I see her almost as a blur, like the cartoon of the Roadrunner. My mother who washed all the dishes as soon as the last bite of food vanished from the plate. My mother who held my doctor brother's foot until he fell asleep when he was still a boy. My mother who sat at the kitchen table with us, always ready to hear the stories of our lives, ready to tell the story of hers. My mother who told me everything that was wrong with me, so I still hear her voice, though she said she only told me for my own good. My mother who loved the feel of the earth on her hands, who smelled the flour and spices, who baked thousands of loaves of bread, cooked innumerable fragrant meals for her children and grandchildren in her basement kitchen. My mother who taught me how to laugh. My mother who could not read or write, and though she wanted to go to school, my father wouldn't let her. Women don't need to go to school, he said. My mother who did not know how much money my father had in the bank and never wrote a check. My mother who wanted to learn how to do everything. My mother who could quote poems she memorized in 3rd grade in Italy before she was forced to leave school. My mother who drew an imaginary line around us to keep us close. The front stoop, our boundary. The family, our country. Her little sturdy body, better than any magic charm. My mother whose skin turned orange before she died. Though the week before she got sick, she planted a huge garden. We were sure she was too powerful to die. Ma, even now, 10 years after the funeral procession led us to Calvary Cemetery and to the mausoleum drawer they filed you in. I wish I could drive over to your house and find you there. Your earthy humor, your warm arms that always were the place I call home. She's dead 20 years and I still get teary when I think about her. She was the most amazing cook in the whole universe. But then I went to Italy and I discovered in Italy there are many, many amazing cooks, but my mother was truly a genius in the kitchen. So would you like me to read?
Yes, let's read as many as we can.
Okay. I'm going to read a poem about when I was a child. Wait a second, just have to find it. It's called Jacob's Department Store. When I was growing up, we'd go to Jacob's Department Store in Paterson, New Jersey. My mother, brother, sister, and I made our way to the shoe department to get our shoes. They carried brown Oxfords, Buster Brown, the only name brand item my mother ever bought for us. No ballerina shoes for us, only those chunky Oxfords, trying to ensure our feet would be as safe as she tried to keep us. In the shoe department, they had a machine that x-rayed your feet so they could fit you with the perfect size shoes. I loved that machine, sliding my feet into it so I could see the bones in my feet, the shape of them like silver shadows. How easy it was to see the interior of the foot, the bones of the toes. But today, nothing is easy. I'd like to slide my life into that foot measuring machine, figure out why, on a day so bright with autumn, my worry is darker than all beauty, and nothing is easy. Not the email I get from my son in Texas saying, I don't want to talk about it, but Texas stinks. I know my son, a man of few words, has sent out a distress call louder than a sonic boom. And if I ask him, he won't tell me what's wrong, though he used to tell me everything when he was a boy and I sat on the side of his bed and held his hand until he fell asleep. And nothing is easy, not my worry about my husband whom I left behind yesterday, even though his head is bent sideways on his neck, so it looks as though he's going to hit doorways and walls, and often does. Not my guilt that when I went to bed the other night, I heard him cursing and shouting, and I heard the aide who now lives with us because he can't be left alone go downstairs, and I fell asleep anyway. And my guilt when the aide tells me the next morning that he was trying to get to the bathroom and fell and wet his pants, and she had to calm him down and change his clothes and wash him, the way I did so many times before she moved in. And I am ashamed that I have hired someone else to do what I can't manage anymore. I don't need that foot machine to see how devastated and broken the lines of my life have become. And no shoes to fix what is wrong. And I'd like to read a poem about my grandson. When my son and his family moved to Texas, my grandson was in a new high school, and he was very unhappy. I mean, he was just starting a middle school, and he left his friends in North Carolina, and he suddenly got chunky, and people were making fun of him, and it was a very, very difficult first year in Texas, to say the least. Can't really blame Texas for that. I think bullying goes on all over. Canada too, I'm sure.
Yes.
The boys call my grandson names. I carry my grandson's picture in my wallet now, as though by carrying with me I could make the boys in his junior high stop calling him names. In the picture he has his arms folded across his chest, as though that would prevent people from noticing the weight he's gained. In the same way I wear black, hoping I'll hide the obvious fact that I am no longer 104 pounds. His mother tells me that often when she picks him up from his new school in Texas, he's crying. His best friend from North Carolina still calls him every week. They spend an hour on the phone together, and I hear in his voice how happy he is when he talks to him, how words spill over themselves. When he hangs up, he goes to his room and does not come out for an hour. I know that for the rest of his life he will remember the names those boys call him, the names he's too ashamed to repeat to his mother and father, though they ask him, "What is it? What is it?" he refuses to say. I think of those wood-burning kits you can use to burn a name on a cabin or a door, and know the names they call him are burned in his memory in letters as thick and dark as any you could hang on a door. And he will carry those voices with him even when he is old and has lived his life, the way we all remember the first time other children pointed at us and laughed, and the loneliness of a junior high field where no one picks you for a team or calls you friend.
How is he now, your grandson?
Oh, he's much better. They moved him to a little school, and now he's started going to a community college because he's not old enough actually to go away to school yet. But this little school has graduated them, but they go into a community college for the first year and just do a couple of classes. But he's still only 17.
I'm happy. It's better.
I'd like to. Oh no, I better not read that because my daughter will be very annoyed with me. The problem with writing narrative poetry and poetry that is very, very personal is that the people you write about have to be willing to have you write about them. So I'm going to read My Friend Reads to Her Children. My friend reads the story of Beauty and the Beast to her two little girls, Kaylin 5, Keen 2. Keen is dressed in a Princess Bella outfit, all pink and sparkly. A tiara sits on her curly blonde hair. Kaylin is suddenly a grown-up little girl, articulate and solemn and sensitive. They both listen and comment while my friend reads. I listen too and enjoy the theatrical quality of my friend's voice. When I was a child, my parents didn't speak English, so they couldn't read stories to me, though my mother would sit us in the padded rocker next to the coal stove that heated the apartment and tell us Italian folk tales that were as mesmerizing and frightening as Grimm's Grimmest Tale. In grammar school, teachers read stories to us. I loved the sound of the story read out loud by someone for whom English was a first language. And then one day I turned the dial on the radio and heard Sleeping Beauty read aloud by an actress. I loved hearing the story, the way her words drew me into a world far removed from that Paterson kitchen. And every week after that, I'd sit for an hour listening to another story read by the actress with the beautiful voice. I sit next to Kaylin when her mother reads, and I remember sitting with my son and daughter in my arms so many years ago. I am gratified for the blessings of these children, the way they reach out their arms to me when I arrive, the way they quarrel over who will sit next to me, the way when Kaylin puts her arms around me, my daughter at 4 comes alive for me again, and the child I was and sometimes still am floats into the story, the way I did when I listened to the radio in that 17th Street apartment while the coal stove crackled and sparked, and the language was smooth and comforting as satin on my skin. I'd like to read a couple of poems. I don't know how much time I have, so I want to just read a couple of poems from What We Pass On, which is my collected poems, and which was published by Guernica Editions in Toronto, Canada. And I'm very grateful for the amount of time they gave me in publishing my book since 1994, and then in putting out this collection, which is basically all the books that they published from 1994 until 2010, and that also has some new poems in it. And this is a poem about my son. What I can't face about someone I love. That my son loves me, but would prefer not to see me too much. Every Sunday night when I call him in Dallas, where he lives with his wife and 2 children, I can hear the heaviness in his voice, his hello tempered with impatience, our conversation stiff and stilted. They always think I can talk to a stone. Strangers in buses and trains tell me their life histories. Acquaintances tell me about their affairs and shattered marriages, show me the secret undersides of their lives. My graduate students vie for my attention. They want to sit next to me and carry my bags and fetch my lunch. But my son can't wait to get off the phone with me. I ask how the kids are, or specific questions about school, ask about his wife, his job. He answers with 1 or 2 words. They're fine, or okay, or the same. My son is a lawyer. He was always brilliant with language, at least written language, and he can read a 300-page book in an hour and remember every detail. But with me, he turns mute as a stump. If I ask for help with some legal problem, he will give it. But I do not hear in his voice the lilt I hear in my daughter's voice when I call her. Instead, I hear reluctance, as though his attention were focused on some truly fascinating person and he can't wait to get off the phone. I tell stories that I hope will amuse him, but finally, after struggling and finding no response, I say, "Well, John, have a good week. Give everyone a hug for me." I know my son has divorced me, somewhere deep inside himself in a place he doesn't look at. I am too much for him, too loud, too dramatic, too frantic, too emotional. I laugh too much. I wear him out in a minute and a half. If he never saw me again, he wouldn't miss me. And this is what I can't face about someone I love.
Is this how you feel now too?
Since this book came out, he's been much more. I think his own children are growing up, and he's starting to be very aware of how time is a circle and things go around. And I remember when I was about 40. My son's in his early 40s. When I was about 40, my mother irritated me so much because she was always very critical. So, she used to really annoy the hell out of me. Am I allowed to say hell on here? You can erase it.
No, you can say.
Okay.
Yes.
And so, I'd get really, and my daughter says, "Remember when you used to scream at Grandma?" And yes, I do remember it, unfortunately. And but then I just hit a certain stage as my own children started growing up, and I realized just what she had gone through, and she had gone through a great deal because she came to this country as an immigrant. She didn't speak English. She couldn't really read English, or very hesitantly read English. And because they were poor, public education ended for them. They lived in the mountains in southern Italy. So in 3rd grade, she had to leave school, and she loved school. She was a really bright woman, and she had to leave school. So she worked in the fields, and then because she was a wonderful cook, even at age 9, they had her cook for the whole family. So there were 9 people, and she cooked every morning before she went to the field. And I went to see the house about 5 or 6 years ago. They made me an honorary citizen of my mother's town, and I saw the house where she was born, and I understood why she didn't want animals in the house, because right next to, in the winter, they bring the animals down to a barn that was attached to the house, which had to be slightly smelly. And I went in, and my first cousins are living in the house, and they tried to modernize it, but they had a regular stove. But my mother cooked in the fireplace, and it's a big fireplace but they put the television in the fireplace. It was kind of hysterical. But I think of my mother cooking all this food in a really primitive, big fireplace. I mean, it's a big, round, it was like colonial times. And so she was really shocked, because when I saw that fireplace, I realized she didn't cook on a stove. There was no real oven. There was the way pizza kitchens have that oven at the bottom built into the brick. It was sort of like a warming oven or something. I don't know how she did it, but she made bread, and she did everything in that until she was 23, when she lived in that house. And then she met my father, and they came to the United States. So, but she was just an amazing cook, I have to say. I don't know why I started telling you that story. Anyway, I want to read a couple of poems. One is a poem called 90s, and it's about I didn't read this before, did I?
No.
Okay. This is a poem about my husband and about when we were young, and about bridal showers. They have bridal showers in Canada. Do they do that?
Yes.
Like parties for brides.
Yes.
90s. At my bridal shower, someone gave me a pink see-through nightgown and pink satin slippers with slender heels and feathers. The gown had feathers on it, too. I've always hated my legs, and even then when I was still thin and in good shape, I didn't want to wear that nightgown or slippers, didn't want to parade in front of you like some pinup. But I wore them anyway. All those negligees I got as shower presents, sleazy nylon I didn't know was tacky. In all the young years of our marriage, I wore a different nightgown every night. Not that it ever stayed on for long. And afterwards I'd pull it back on, afraid our children would find me naked in our bed. I felt so sophisticated in those nightgowns, like the ones Doris Day wore in movies. Only years later, when my daughter buys me a nightgown made of soft and smooth blue silk, do I realize that the first ones I owned were cheap imitations of this, the one I hold now to my cheek. Grateful to have been once what I was. How lucky I am to have loved you in nylon, in silk, in my own incredible skin.
Your husband passed away.
May 5th, 2010, he died. And he had early onset Parkinson's disease, so he was ill for a long time. And the Silence in the Empty House deals a lot with that. And there are poems about, as he got worse in each of these books. But that book really deals with his physical deterioration over a period of time, and then eventually his mental deterioration. Anyway, I'm going to read a poem called Spike Heels. I don't know if you know what spike heels are.
No.
High heels with the
Oh.
big tall heel. Skinny heel, pointy
Stiletto.
toes they had. In the 1950s, I wore spike heels. They were high, but I was thin then, didn't wobble. I walked through hours at my job, my high heels twinkly as Dorothy's red slippers, high heels with pointy toes, heels in every possible color. Slingbacks and pumps, the clickety-clack of them on pavement, making me feel as sophisticated as Marilyn Monroe. Older now, my heels have gone lower and lower, reduced to sandals with Velcro straps to hold my triple E feet. I still watch women striding in their spiked heels and wish for 1 minute that I could go back to the days when I could walk with such grace, look with longing at this marker of beauty, as though I were still 16 and not this woman I'd become, pounding through life on confident feet. I always think that my granddaughter, oh Lord, I can't quite believe it, but my granddaughter is 21. That does not seem possible, but my granddaughter is 21. And she's very conscious of the way she looks, and, very, very interested in clothes and styling her hair in all different ways, and putting pink stripes in her hair, which her mother is horrified by, and all that. And I think how long a time it is that we think our exterior selves are more important than our interior selves. And I keep saying, you can't, unless you find the thing you love. It doesn't matter what you look like on the outside. I mean, the world thinks it matters. Obviously, my granddaughter with her long legs and my gorgeous granddaughter walks in, and people are going to say, oh, look how sophisticated, look how thin, look how tall, look what long legs, look at that long neck. But in the end, is that going to do her any good? Our faces all end up falling. Our bodies end up succumbing to gravity. And if we don't have an interior self, nothing does us any good. And so I try to really give her that kind of advice but it's hard, because at that age, what do you think about? Think about your long legs and your long neck and your skinny body and nothing else, right? I'm wondering if on the last tape I read Daddy, We Called You, did I?
No.
Okay, I want to read this poem because this
Sure.
was my signature poem.
We haven't actually read too many on our last in our last meeting.
No, we
just
didn't.
a few, like 2 or 3 poems. That's it.
Right, I know that there were a small number.
Yes.
Daddy, we called you Daddy when we talked to each other in the street, pulling on our American faces, shaping our lives in Paterson slang. Paterson's in New Jersey. Inside our house, we spoke a southern Italian dialect mixed with English, and we called you Papa. But outside again, you became Daddy, and we spoke of you to our friends as my father. Imagine we were speaking of that father knows best TV character in his dark business suit, carrying his briefcase into his house, retreating to his paneled den, his big living room and dining room, his frilly aproned wife who greeted him at the door with a kiss. Such space and silence in that house. We lived in one big room, living room, dining room, kitchen, bedroom, all in one, dominated by the great oak dining table around which we sat, talking and laughing, listening to your stories, your political arguments with your friends. Papa, how you glowed in company light, happy when the other immigrants came to you for help with their taxes or legal papers. It was only outside that glowing circle that I denied you. Denied your long hours as night watchman at Royal Machine Shop. One night, riding home from a date, my middle-class American boyfriend kissed me at the light. I looked up and met your eyes as you stood at the corner near Royal Machine. It was nearly midnight, January, cold and windy. The cold and windy. You were waiting for the bus, the street light illuminating your face. I pretended I did not see you. Let my boyfriend pull away, leaving you on the empty corner, waiting for the bus to take you home. You never mentioned it. Never said you knew how often I lied about what you did for a living, or that I was ashamed to have my boyfriend see you, find out about your second shift work, your broken English. Today, remembering that moment, still illuminated in my mind by the street lamp's gray light, I think of my own son and the distance between us greater than miles. Papa, silk worker, janitor, night watchman, immigrant Italian. Better than any father. Excuse me, I seem to be losing my place. Papa, silk worker, janitor, night watchman, immigrant Italian, I honor the years you spent in menial work, slipping down the ladder as your body failed you, while your mind so quick and sharp longed to escape. Honor the times you got out of bed after sleeping only an hour to take me to school or pick me up. The warm bakery rolls you bought for me on the way home from the night shift, the letters you wrote to the editors of local newspapers. Papa, silk worker, janitor, night watchman, immigrant Italian. Better than any father knows best father, bland as white rice. With your wine press in the cellar, with the newspapers you collected out of garbage piles to turn into money you banked for us. With your mousetraps, with your cracked and calloused hands, with your yellow teeth. Papa, dragging your dead leg through the factories of Paterson. I am outside the house now, shouting your name. I felt I owed him that poem because I spent so much time when I was growing up being embarrassed by his lack of, his inability to speak English. He could read English perfectly, and he was actually like a people's lawyer. He taught himself how to do legal papers, how to send for people in Italy, how to do wills and sell houses and all that in Italy. And he would take people to the consulate in Newark, the Italian consulate in Newark, because they were afraid to go by themselves. And he was actually much better educated than my mother in Italian. And we had an uncle who was a priest, and so he got the kind of education my mother couldn't really get. But he had trouble with English, and he'd say, my tongue gets caught around it. It gets caught in my tongue, I can't do it. And so he really had difficulty with that, but he read everything he'd get his hands on. He knew about every war in the universe. You ask him about some political figure in Africa, he could tell you all about the person. And he was wonderful in math. He was amazing. He was so annoyed at me because my mathematical skills are limited. And he said, I can't understand all those years in school, and you can't add, multiply, and divide in your head, because he could. He balanced my checkbook till he was 86 years old. And my brother got the scientific part. My brother first got his PhD in physical chemistry, and then he taught at Columbia for a few years, and then he decided that he was going to go back to school and be a doctor, so he became a doctor. And his son got also that scientific bent, and his son is a professor of physical chemistry at the University of Chicago and has a PhD from Harvard. So, we've come a long way since my poor mother came here on that in the steerage when she was 5 months pregnant, and had to be in the bottom of that boat throwing up the whole time over with about 9,000 other people. I can only imagine how horrified she was that she had to, I bet she got up every time and cleaned it all up herself.
Yes.
She did have me as it's kind of hysterical when you think of it, because let me see if I have that here. She did have, I want to see if I have the video. I'll show it to you after. I was born in this little tenement on Fifth Avenue in Paterson, and my mother delivered me herself because my father went to get the doctor, but they didn't have a telephone, so he had to walk to a store where he could call the doctor from a public payphone. And by the time the doctor got there, my mother had not only delivered me, cut the cord, washed me, wrapped me up, and was sitting there with me. He never even came into the room. And she said when she was dying, he was afraid that he would catch it. And I said, catch what? And she said, poverty. But she had laid out, and she was very neat. Mrs. Clean, she really was. She was horrified by me. She'd be horrified by this, my messiness. But she had laid out all these towels that she had brought with her from Italy, part of the dowry, la biancheria. So she had put out these very clean, crisp, and soap and everything else for the guy. And he was afraid to come into the room. He never checked her to see if she was okay. He never did anything.
Who was afraid? The doctor?
Yeah, he was a real doctor, but he had expensive clothes on, and this was a tenement. But it was very clean tenement. I know my mother, it was not a dirty tenement, but I think he didn't want to get his beautiful suit and his beautiful shoes and his starched shirt dirty. So he goes, "Oh, you'll be okay." He stood at the door. Oh, you're okay. You'll be okay. Never checked me, never checked her, and I think my mother figured I didn't need him anyway. I did it myself. So do we have time for?
Yes, we do.
One more poem, or
we have 15 minutes.
Oh, we have 15 minutes, so I can do a few more. A few more poems, and I think that I want to read. I called "A Dream of My Grandmother and Great Grandmother." I never met them because they were too poor to come to the United States, and we were too poor to go there. So my mother and father, my mother left Italy when she was 23, and she never saw her parents again. That was it. And so they were blue airmail letters to us. And sometimes somebody would go to the little village and they'd bring a camera and they'd take a picture, so we'd get a little Kodak snapshot, but not many pictures of them at all, not many. I dream of my grandmother and great-grandmother. I imagine them walking down rocky paths toward me, strong Italian women returning at dusk from fields where they worked all day on farms built like steps up the sides of steep mountains. Graceful women carrying water in terracotta jugs on their heads. What I know of these women whom I never met, I know from my mother a few pictures of my grandmother standing at the doorway of the Fieldstone house in San Mauro, the stories my mother told of them. But I know them most of all from watching my mother, her strong arms lifting sheets out of the cold water in the wringer washer, or from the way she stepped back, wiping her hands on her homemade flour sack apron, and admired her jars of canned peaches that glowed like amber in the dim cellar light. I see those women in my mother as she worked grinning and happy in her garden that spilled its bounty into her arms. She gave away baskets of peppers, lettuce, eggplant, gave away bowls of pasta, meatballs, zeppoli, loaves of homemade bread. It was a miracle, she said. The more I gave away, the more I had to give. Now I see her in my daughter, the same unending energy, that quick mind, that hand open and extended to the world. When I watch my daughter clean the kitchen counter, watch her turn, laughing, I remember my mother as she lay dying. How she said of my daughter, "That Jennifer, she's all the treasure you'll ever need." I turn now as my daughter turns and see my mother walking toward us down crooked mountain paths. Behind her, all those women dressed in black. I think about all those women dressed in black, and I think that my mother, despite the fact that she did not have a formal education, was one of the wisest and most driven women. I know where I get my drive from. Both my mother and father were really driven, and my mother, for example, one time my mother looked across the street and the mason across the street was rebuilding his front steps, and she watched from the front window while he did it. And then the next day she made my father drive her to the cement place, and she bought cement, and she bought, what are they called? Those big stones, and she bought all the things that she would need to rebuild her steps. She went out with she was about 4'11". She went out with a pickaxe, and she knocked the steps down, and then she carted all the stuff away, and then she made a frame, and she built the steps, and they lasted, that was probably about 1959 or something like 1959, and the steps lasted until she died in, I think, 1990. She died in 1990. So the steps lasted till beyond when she died. They lasted actually until my father died in 1998. And then we rebuilt them. But I mean, she said, "Oh, it was easy. It was like icing a cake." With this cement. Oh, it's easy. It's like icing a cake. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's like icing a cake, all right. I'm going to read a couple of other poems, and one of the poems I'd like to read is a poem called "Growing Up Italian." When I was a little girl, I thought everyone was Italian, and that was good. We visited our aunts and uncles, and they visited us. The Italian language smooth and sweet in my mouth. In kindergarten, English words fell on me, thick and sharp as hail. I grew silent, the Italian word balanced on the edge of my tongue, and the English word lost during the first moment of every question. It did not take me long to learn that dark-skinned people were greasy and dirty. Poor children were even dirtier. To be dark-skinned and poor was to be dirtiest of all. Almost every day, Mr. Landgraf called Joey a spaghetti bender. I knew that was bad. I tried to hide by folding my hands neatly on my desk and being a good girl. Judy, one of the girls in my class, had honey blonde hair and blue eyes. All the boys liked her. Her parents and grandparents were born in America. They owned a local tavern. When Judy's mother went downtown, she brought back coloring books and candy. When my mother went downtown, she brought back one small brown bag with a towel or a sheet in it. The first day I wore my sister's hand-me-down coat, Isabel said, "That coat looks familiar. Don't I recognize that coat?" I looked at the ground. When the other children brought presents for the teacher at Christmas, embroidered silk handkerchiefs, and evening in Paris perfume, I brought dishcloths made into a doll. I read all the magazines that told me why blondes have more fun, described girls whose favorite color was blue. I hoped for a miracle that would turn my dark skin light, that would make me pale and blonde and beautiful. So I looked for a man with blonde hair and blue eyes who'd blend right in, who'd give me blonde, blue-eyed children who'd blend right in, and a name that would blend right in. And I'd be melted down to a shape and a color that would blend right in. Till one day, I guess I was 40 by then, I woke up cursing all those who taught me to hate my dark, foreign self, and I said, here I am with my olive-toned skin and my Italian parents and my old poverty real as a scar on my forehead. and all the toys we couldn't buy, all the words I didn't say, all the downcast eyes and folded hands and remarks I didn't make, rise up in me and explode onto paper like firecrackers, like meteors. And I celebrate my Italian-American self rooted in this, my country, where those black, brown, red, yellow, olive-skinned people soon will raise their voices and sing this new anthem. Here I am, and I'm strong, and my skin is warm in the sun, and my dark hair shines, and today I take back my name and wave it in their faces like a bright red flag.
Beautiful poem.
So took me a long time to get there, for sure. Because I don't know how much time we have, I'm going to read a poem that I usually end with now, which is a poem that is both about my husband's death, but also, and grief for that, but also about my grief over the world and what we've done to destroy it, how much we're doing to destroy it. And he happened to be dying just when the BP oil spill, I don't know how much you heard about it in Canada, but here it was big news for many, many weeks. And it was so horrific and horrible to see. And he was dying at the same time. And when he was dying, his hands had turned black at the tips. So that oil spill, and it just got mixed up in my mind. And I'm writing a lot of poems now that are a mixture of the personal and environmental, because my grief for him has gotten really connected to my grief over the world and what we've done to it. Watching the pelican die. On TV, I watch the pelican with its mouth wide open, its wings and body coated with oil. I do not hear the sound, and since this is a photograph, I don't know if it was caught in that mouth-stretched howl when it died, or is it howling in recognition that it cannot survive the thick coat of oil that bears it down. The ladies who take care of you when I'm gone tell me you are having trouble. His hands, they say, his hands. When I come home, I see that your hands have turned black at the tips, and when I get closer, the ends of your fingers have been eaten away. I watch the dead bird in the Gulf floating on top of the water, its legs stiff and straight in the air, its body drained of all motion all night. The announcer on CNN says BP didn't want the photographer to take pictures of the dying birds covered as they are with the black slick of oil. They were hoping, he says, that the birds would sink and the evidence would be swallowed by the ocean. At late afternoon, I hear my daughter cry out. I rush to see what's happened. You are stretched out on the bed, your body so thin you look like a small boy. I call 911. The ambulance takes you to the hospital. BP is trying to put a cap on the spewing oil rig. Clumps of oil wash ashore and float on the surface of the water. The beach is littered with dead fish and birds. At the hospital, they want to know whether we want extraordinary measures. No, I say, he has a living will. In my mind, I see that screaming bird, its mouth wide open, a picture of tormented despair. I reach out to hold your hand, stroke your forehead. Dennis, I call out. Dennis, you do not hear. The doctor comes in to see you. Well, he said, he should have been dead 5 years ago. What did you expect? You shouldn't have taken such good care of him. We did everything we could, the BP president says, looking directly at the camera. It's not such a calamity, the governor of Louisiana says. We stand around your hospital bed. My brother comes in and says, I'll try a stronger antibiotic. It's bad, he says, but he waits until we're in the hall to tell me. The social worker tells me you should put him in a nursing home. My brother says, you've kept him home all this time. If he gets stronger, I'll let him go home and he'll be able to be around the things he knows. The doctor comes in and says he's not going to make it, almost imagining that he's deaf and dumb as well as ill. The social worker admonishes us with her bag of common sense. She does not love you. We take you home. The MSNBC reporter stands on the beach in a hurricane and picks up a huge glob of oil with a stick. Look, she says, look, and drips the oil on the white sand. Dead fur birds float by behind her. I'm in pain, you say, though you've not complained before. I am in so much pain. Althea feeds you a jar of baby applesauce. You open your mouth and accept the food. When I see the pelican on TV with its mouth wide open in horror, I remember you as you lay dying. On the Gulf, the earth and the sea are being destroyed just as you were by the disease that finally defeated you. Some things are bigger than all of us. If there is enough carelessness and greed in the world, even the ocean can be destroyed. And you, who fought against this illness with such courage, even you cannot survive the blackened tips of your fingers, the oil heavy on the bird's feathers, the birds dead and floating on the surface that gradually sink and disappear. So I'm sure that's not a very cheery poem, but it's a poem that I think is important for me to read and to write, and because I don't want to end on a negative note, because I'm really a very optimistic kind of person. I just like to, I mean, I don't know how much more time we have, so I'd just like to read.
Another poem we have.
Okay, this is called The Ducks Walk Across River Street in Paterson, New Jersey. Now, Paterson, New Jersey is an eastern United States city that used to be have a section that was very well to do and had all the robber barons and the people who made tons of money off the backs of poor and immigrant labor used to live there, and now they've all moved out. And so it's suffering economically. The factories are all gone. It's really having a great deal of difficulty, as are many cities that were once industrial cities, when so much manufacturing was moved to India and China and Korea. Then, you know, where was this manufacturing? Where to go? It left these cities and left them without work for people.
Yes.
Anyway, the ducks walk across River Street. Yesterday, a family of ducks crosses River Street. All the cars in both directions stop to let them go by. Their black heads proud in the air, their beaks pointed ahead, straight and self-satisfied. They do not hurry. They walk as though they own the world. 2 grown ducks, 3 ducklings, 2 more ducks taking up the rear. You'd think they lived on some curvy lane in the English countryside, somewhere near Wordsworth Cottage perhaps, instead of on the Passaic River, reeking of garbage, redolent of waste, near the edge of River Street with its thrift shop and boxing gym and car wash and its gaggle of homeless men who sit in broken down chairs on the edge of the river, as though they too were at some expensive resort. How self-contained the ducks are, all of us watching them, the people in their cars heading to work, the homeless men mumbling or staring at the trees, trailing their long fingers in the river, the ducks certain in their smooth feathers that the road and the river are theirs by right, as they move graceful as dancers onto the water and let it lift them into the dazzling morning light. I always have to find something positive. I mean, in the worst situation, I am compelled to find some positive thing, and that seemed to me the perfect way to end this book. And in every one of my books, I try to end on an up note, and perhaps I have my head buried in the sand. I don't know, but that's just part of my personality, and I'm just if something bad happens, I find a way to make it better. And I'm like my mother. She would, if you fell on the floor with a broken leg, she'd say, "Get up, stop moaning. Get up, you can do it. It's all in your head. Just pick yourself and go on. Pick yourself up and go on." And that philosophy she may only have gone to the 3rd grade, but she was a wise woman. And it has served me in very good stead in my life. While I see lots of people around me falling apart at the first crisis, you could hit me on the head with a mallet and I'm still going to get up. You tell me I can't do something, it's impossible, it's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. I say, "Oh yeah, you haven't met me."
Well, she got that philosophy from the women in black.
She got that philosophy from the women in black. I think they couldn't allow anything to defeat them. They used to wash their clothes in a brook, cold up there in the winter.
Yes.
And you know, you think of Italy as very
And
warm
everything
and
by
sunny.
hand.
They had to do it by
Washing.
hand. They would beat the clothes with the rocks. He'd beat the clothes on the rocks. And when she came to the United States, she couldn't afford a washing machine, so she had a scrub board, which took the place of the rocks, and she would scrub. And then for a long time, she had, the washing machines, probably not, you're too young, but the washing machines, they had rollers, and you
Yes.
had to wash the clothes and then feed them through the roller. And one time she got her hand caught in the roller. It was a
Yes.
dangerous process,
Yes.
and the water was so cold. And you had to put your hands in that water and then lift these heavy sheets out and put them through the wringer, and then they would come out the other side, and the water would be squeezed out of them. Of course, your hands were frozen by that point, but she didn't let anything stop her. She just kept going, and it was a very good philosophy, and I think one she's passed on to me, and one I've tried to pass on to my children, as my brother has tried to pass on to his children, that same philosophy, not letting anything stop him, and his children not letting anything stop him. When my daughter graduated from Georgetown, and when she graduated, she was editor-in-chief of the yearbook, and I brought the yearbook home to my mother, and she's looking at the yearbook, and there are gorgeous pictures of these upper middle class and upper class kids with their straight teeth and their great skin, and all that. And of course the sun is shining on these beautiful ivy-covered buildings, and my mother kept going, "Oh, how beautiful, how beautiful, how beautiful." And then she said to me, she turns to me and she says, "I was so proud of you the day you graduated from college." I said, "Why didn't you tell me? It was 25 years ago. Now you're telling me 25 years later?" She says, "I didn't want to bring bad luck on you. Other people should say positive things about your children, but you shouldn't." She was always mad at me because I praised my children to the skies. And she would say, "You can't do that." But with my daughter, she got up then because she had work to do. She got up, she was holding this yearbook, and she said, "Only in America, because going from what she came from to my daughter going to this very expensive school and being surrounded by people that were so obviously upper middle class, I think my mother just couldn't quite believe it, from San Mauro to America. She didn't have time to dwell on that. She had to cook.
Yeah.
She was busy. She had to get going. But she did sit for 5 minutes and tell me she was proud of me on the day that I graduated from college. Funny.
I'm very grateful to you for reading all these poems, not just to me but to the entire world. I'm going to post them on the internet tonight.
Oh, good.
I'm going back to Canada right now. So
You're going now?
Yes, I'm leaving, and I'll be there by 5 p.m. and I will
Oh, good. Post them. That's wonderful.
You'll
And then
see
I'll
them
tell
tonight.
them. I'll tell my assistant to post them on our webpage, or a link at least on our webpage if it can't be posted on the webpage. So I'll tell her it's going to.
Yeah, by 8 p.m. tonight it's going to be.
About 8 p.m. All right, good.
Thank you so
good.
much.
I hope they like it. I hope
Yes.
you get good letters and phone calls and emails about it.
I'm sure. Thank you
It's
very
such a
much.
pleasure to meet you.
I will
And-
come back for you.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Come back when my new book comes out. Make sure
Yes.
you take a picture of my new Canadian book, Writing Poetry to Save Your Life. How to find the courage to tell your stories.
Thank you very, very much.
And so thank you very much. It's wonderful. It's always nice to think you're reaching out to other places in the world, and always love going other places to read. And because I feel as though my mother never could have imagined this happening to me, and that I would be where I am today. Or did she imagine that my brother was going to end up as a doctor? No, she couldn't imagine that my brother was going to end up as a doctor, or that my nephew was going to end up as a full professor at the University of Chicago in physics and theoretical chemistry, or that my daughter was going to end up as a professor, or my son as a lawyer. It's just, I don't think that ever occurred to them. I had to fight to go to college, so you can imagine what a large leap it was to get to where the kids are. So I guess that's it.
I'll leave the end open.
Excuse me?
It's an open end.
It's an open ending, yes. And hello, Canada. but my parents couldn't read to me in English. So when I went to school and I had teachers who read in English and read stories and poems, I began to fall in love with the rhythms of the English language, and I wanted to write poetry. And I started writing poetry very early. I was probably 8 years old. My first poem was published when I was 13. It was a poem about a dog wagging his tail. I didn't have a dog. I didn't know anything about dogs, and I made the mistake of what every young writer does, which is make the mistake of writing about something I knew absolutely nothing about. And then by the time the poem was published, I realized how bad the poem was, because by then I was in high school and I had read many of the major American poets at that point and many of the major English poets. And so I had much more exposure to the English literary tradition and to realize that my own poem was not very good. In fact, it was terrible, actually. I began to write more and more poems and to get more and more poems published very early, actually. And I taught in a college. I taught English in a college when I was a young woman, and then I got married and I got pregnant, and I stayed home with my children for a little while and then went back to teaching. But I did stay home for the first 5 or 6 years of my children's lives, but I also was an adjunct instructor at the same time. So I became more and more involved in writing poetry, but I was not out in the world with other poets at that point. I was home. I was the traditional 1950s mother and wife. I hate to admit it, but I was, and so I really wasn't out in the world. And when my children got a little older, then I took on more teaching jobs, and I began to join poetry groups and to give poetry readings in libraries. Any place where anybody asked me, I gave poetry readings. And then in 1980, I won a New Jersey State Council on the Arts grant in poetry. So for the first time, even though I'd been writing poems since I was a little kid, for the first time I thought, I can call myself a poet because the New Jersey State Council on the Arts has given me this grant, and it was the highest grant they gave that year in poetry. And the day I sent in the application, I was supposed to be washing the curtains in my daughter's room, and I had taught all day, and then I came home and I was going to go wash the curtains in my daughter's room, and then I thought, well, I'll just send in this application. And I have to admit, it wasn't a very neat application that I sent in, and I brought it to the post office at 5 minutes to 5. The post office was going to close at 5 o'clock. And I put it in, and I thought, oh, you'll never get this. Ridiculous. You should have washed the curtains. And then I got the letter saying I had gotten this grant. So for the first time, I felt there's outside, I have this seal of approval that says I can call myself a poet. That same year, I had applied for a grant to start a poetry center at Passaic County Community College in Paterson. I had already actually started it in 1977, and we had a magazine, and I started a poetry contest, and I started asking my friends who were poets to come and read for nothing. So I applied for a small grant from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts so that I could pay for the magazine and I could pay poets to come to the college to read, and I could at least pay them a small amount of money. And I started bringing in more regional poets and people who had more of a reputation. Gradually, I expanded the Poetry Center and was able to increase the amount of money that I got from the State Council, from the National Endowment for the Arts, from individual grants, to bring in internationally and nationally known poets. So I've had poets like Allen Ginsberg, C.K. Williams, Gerald Stern, Ruth Stone, Diane DePrima, just about every major poet has read here. Some of them have since died, like William Stafford passed away, and he's a major American poet. He's in all the anthologies. Ginsberg is in all the anthologies, and Ginsberg was very, very supportive of what I did here in Paterson. And in fact, once at a poetry reading where he read for me, he passed me a note and he said, "What you have done here is absolutely amazing." And it was so wonderful to get that seal of approval from Allen Ginsberg, who didn't give many seals of approval. I have to say he was very critical, but of what I had accomplished with the Poetry Center, he was very, very supportive and very happy. So I've been able to bring major poets to Paterson. When I first started the Poetry Center, people said nobody's going to go there because it's a poor city, and how can you establish a poetry center when poetry center tends poetry centers tend to attract people who have studied poetry and who are perhaps more middle class or upper middle class people, and the area here is not wealthy. But I've done it. And not only have I done it, but we're going into our 33rd year, and we're known around the world. The Poetry Center is known around the world. In fact, once, since you're Canadian, I'm going to tell you that once I went to give a reading in Toronto, and I was invited to a home of a professor from the University of Toronto. And as soon as I walked in the door and said my name, he said, "Oh, you're the Poetry Center in Paterson, and you have a brick building on your logo." And it was so exciting. Here I am in Canada. I walk in the door, and 5 seconds later, the man knows about the Poetry Center, knows about the Paterson Poetry Prize, knows about the Allen Ginsberg Awards, and knows about the Poetry Center. It's a very gratifying thing to have that happen. And people come from all over. I have famous poets who come here and give workshops, and so people have had a chance to come to the Poetry Center and study with really people who've won the Pulitzer Prize. It has been very, very gratifying and very exciting. And I'm also happy with what I've been able to accomplish at Binghamton, where I started the Binghamton Center for Writers. This is the Poetry Center at Passaic County Community College. I have to say I also started the Passaic County Cultural and Heritage Council, which gives out grant money to arts organizations in Passaic County. We have 3 art galleries. We have a collection of contemporary art that I got this idea. I get little ideas and they become gigantic ideas. But I got this idea that we could ask some of the people whose work has been exhibited here to donate work to the contemporary art collection. And so we now have a very large contemporary art collection here, and people are writing to us asking if they can donate work to the art collection. And we also have the Theater and Poetry Project, which sends writers into the schools. So it's been a really exciting thing to do this. And then in addition to that, I started a lot of programs at Binghamton, bringing editors to Binghamton so that to increase the chances of students being published and of faculty being published. I started one of the centers of excellence at the university. The Binghamton Center for Writers is one of the centers of excellence, which is a major designation. When I first said I wanted to do that, I won't say who, but one of the professors said, "Oh, that can't be done." And I did it. So you can never tell me that can't be done because I will do it. And I've been really happy. We have famous writers who come to read. I started 2 book awards there. I have book awards here that I started. So not only have I been writing like crazy my whole life, but I've managed to promote other writers. And I think that's a very important thing to do. It's like casting bread on the waters. Only instead of bread, I put poetry out on the waters.
Take you back again to your childhood. Your images as a girl
Are very clear, aren't they? I remember better what happened 70 years ago than I do what happened yesterday.
You always describe yourself as a girl who was forced into having curls to look more American. You would describe yourself as a girl with sad eyes.
Yeah.
You even used the word ugly.
Right. I think that's the way I saw myself. I saw myself as ugly, foreign.
You saw yourself like that, or other people?
No, my sense of myself, I think because of the images that we were presented with in school were Dick and Jane images. Mm-hmm. The white colonial house, the upper middle class father with his pipe and his cardigan sweater, the little dog with a doghouse that looked better than the house I lived in. And so I grew up with this image of myself, not inside my house, because inside my house I felt really accepted and like being Italian was wonderful. But as soon as I walked out the door, being Italian wasn't so acceptable. I was a very serious little kid, and I read all the time. I I had hair that I had very curly hair that stuck out from my head. And I just looked very foreign. And there's a very funny picture of me dressed up when I was about 10 years old as a pilgrim. And so they put this pilgrim costume on me at school. But I look like a pilgrim who just stepped off the boat from Italy. I'm the most unpilgrim-like pilgrim you've ever seen in your life. So it's that was the image I had of myself, as being dark, foreign, ugly. So when I went to look for a man to marry, I definitely didn't want to marry an Italian. I wanted to marry a blonde, blue-eyed American, and I didn't realize that being Irish was not really being American. But my husband lived in a house like the Dick and Jane house, a white colonial house. His parents were upper middle class. They had gone to college. They obviously spoke English. They were Irish, but from 4 generations before, so they had completely assimilated as Americans. My mother-in-law went to college when very few women went to college. I think she graduated from college in 1921 or 22. And there were very few women who were going to college at that point. Certainly nobody I knew went to college, and no woman in my family went to college, although I had a cousin who was so smart she graduated first from Eastside High School, which was full of upper middle class kids. But she, the daughter of immigrants, managed to graduate first, but she didn't go to college. She went to secretarial school.
I was very moved by your poems where you described your mother's frustration for not going to school.
Oh, she wanted to go to school so desperately. You have no idea. She was such a smart woman. And my father wouldn't let her go to night school. He said women, and my father, who was the most liberal person in the world, I think because my mother was very sexy looking, he was afraid men would hit on her. When I look back on it now, he didn't want her to go to school, not because he didn't want her to learn English, but because he didn't want her out in the world where, she was in the house all the time. Even sewing coats, they brought them to the house, and then they picked them up the next day. She would sew the coats at home. And when she finally did go to work in a factory, she went to work where they were all women. All the workers were women. Even the supervisors were women. He didn't want her around any man who might hit on her, who might decide that my mother was a sexy and very ripe-looking woman, and that she might be somebody they might want to flirt with. So he didn't want that. And I know that now because I realize the man was extremely liberal in his ideas. He was an ardent liberal, an ardent unionist, an ardent fighter for rights, but not when it came to my mother. He wouldn't let her go to night school. He would not allow her to go to night school. And so she was always ashamed of the fact that she couldn't read English, basically. And she couldn't write in English, and she couldn't speak English. She tried to speak English, and we tried to teach her how to speak English. But, she always messed it up a little, and I understand that because my Italian is messed up. She spoke broken English. I speak broken Italian, I would call it. So when somebody laughs at my Italian, I feel it's something I really deserve, because we used to laugh at my poor mother's attempt at speaking English. She wanted to learn how to do everything. And one day, I'm going to tell you a story. One day, she saw the mason across the street building his front steps. And she went over and she watched him. And then she said to my father, "You have to drive me to the cement place." And so they went to a place where they could buy bags of cement and cinder blocks, and he already had a wheelbarrow. And she said, "I saw him do it, I'll do it." So she knocked down the front steps. She wasn't even 5 feet tall, my mother. She got a pickaxe, she knocked our front steps down, then she cleared it all off, and then she got the cement, she mixed it, she took the cinder blocks, she built the front steps, and she rebuilt the front steps, and then she finished them off, and then she said, "Oh, that was easy. It was like icing a cake." And she rebuilt those. So there was nothing she couldn't learn to do. She was going to learn how to do everything, except the English. And one time we passed a package store, and my mother thought it was because in the factory they called the goods packaged goods. They called the material that was delivered packaged goods. She thought it was a store that sold material that she could sew dresses out of. And so she said, "Oh, we have to stop there someday." And I said, "Mom, that's a liquor store. Why do you want to stop there? You don't drink." And she said, "They don't sell material." And she was so embarrassed that she had made such a basic, un-American mistake. And I was embarrassed that I had called attention to the fact that she made that mistake.
If you could choose a poem that is about your mother, the dearest one, which one would it be?
Okay, I think it would be this one that's in my latest book. And it's called The Little General. I think this would be the one that I would pick, although I have a lot of poems about my mother and the way nothing stopped her. Nothing stopped her. But I just have to find the poem in it.
Just for the listeners, your brother called her the little general.
My brother called her the Little General. My brother called our mother the Little General when we were teenagers. My mother driving the car. My mother sitting next to him. Her head, a small dark knob, barely reaching the top of the seat. My bossy mother who told us how to live our lives. My mother who was always moving. When I remember her, I see her almost as a blur, like the cartoon of the Roadrunner, my mother who washed all the dishes as soon as the last bite of food vanished from the plate. My mother who held my doctor brother's foot until he fell asleep when he was still a boy. My mother who sat at the kitchen table with us, always ready to hear the stories of our lives, ready to tell the stories of hers. My mother who told me everything that was wrong with me, so I can still hear her voice, though she has said she told me for my own good. My mother who loved the feel of the earth on her hands, who smelled of flour and spices, who baked thousands of loaves of bread, cooked innumerable fragrant meals for her children and grandchildren in her basement kitchen. My mother who taught me how to laugh. My mother who could not read or write, and though she wanted to go to school, my father wouldn't let her. Women don't need to go to school, he said. My mother who did not know how much money my father had in the bank and never wrote a check. My mother who wanted to learn how to do everything. My mother who could quote poems she memorized in 3rd grade in Italy before she had to leave school. My mother who drew an imaginary line around us to keep us close. The front stoop our boundary, the family our country. Her little sturdy body better than any magic charm. My mother whose skin turned orange before she died, though the week before she got sick, she planted a huge garden. We were sure she was too powerful to die. Ma, even now, 10 years after the funeral procession led us to Calvary Cemetery and to the mausoleum drawer they filed you in. I wish I could drive over to your house and find you there, your earthy humor, your warm arms that always were the place I call home. I hope that's a celebration of my mother. Unfortunately, I've become the Little General myself. But I hope it's a big celebration of my mother because she really deserved to be celebrated. And she was so enormously strong of character that it was hard to believe that she was dying. And when she actually died, we were all in shock. The children, the grandchildren, all of us, really so unbelieving that somebody that strong and that energetic and that full of life could have disappeared off the face of the earth. But in a way, she hasn't disappeared because I feel that she's still with me. And in a way, writing poetry is a way of saving the people that we love. And I've lost a lot of people in the last 20 years. My mother, my father, my sister, my best friends of 40 years, my husband. So a lot of the people who were part of my life for so long are gone, and yet they aren't really gone because I, in a way, by writing about them, I make them alive again. When my father died, I got all these letters from people across the country who knew the poems I had written about him and who felt like they knew him. It was so wonderful. I got these letters of condolence from people who never met my father, but met him in my poems. You know, I'd get letters from people from Montana, where I've never been, who had read the poems and thought they knew him. Found out that he died and wrote me condolence notes. So in a way, that's when poetry works. In a way, poetry makes a wonderful bridge between us. So that my life, which was not the typical American life in some ways, my father, who certainly wasn't the typical American, became somebody that they knew. And even poems about him are on tests that they give kids in American schools in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is very far away from here, and not a place. I was there once when I stopped there, when I was on the way to read in South Dakota. My plane landed in Minneapolis, and I take another plane to Sioux City, Iowa. But they're using them on the tests for kids who are graduating from high school. They're using poems about him in North Carolina, in Texas, in Tennessee, in New Jersey, and in Minnesota. It's wild, isn't it? I mean, it's wild and wonderful. I have had an amazing life, I have to say, and it's because of poetry. And the more I've shared poetry with other people, the more my life has become incredible. And the more I've been able to write about the people I love and the things that have happened to me and the kind of grief I feel for my husband and the grief I feel for the way we're destroying the environment, has formed a bridge between me and my life and the life of other people. I have to say that for the first 40 years of my writing, I was trying to write like an English romantic poet. I thought I had to be an upper middle class person and pretend to be that person in my poems. And then when I won that New Jersey State Council on the Arts grant, and my first book was published that year too, the poems were very much in that English literary tradition. I felt I had to mention Greek gods and all that sort of thing. And I had gone back to graduate school, and a graduate school professor said to me, you know, it's in this one poem about your father that you find the story you have to tell. And he changed my life, that man, because I suddenly thought maybe people would be interested in reading poems by a woman, by a wife, by a mother, by a person who would eventually become a grandmother, by a granddaughter, by a daughter, by an Italian American growing up on 17th Street in an immigrant neighborhood in Paterson, New Jersey. Maybe that is the story you have to tell. How to find the courage to tell your stories. And I think there are stories we have to tell. There are stories we need to tell. And those are the stories that save us. They also save the people around us and the places around us. But they also save us in a way. So in my classes, that's what I try to get people to do, to find the stories they really have to tell. Seeing the world through their eyes is really important. Just like I had to, when I painted, I had to find I couldn't draw a perfect rose, but I could draw Maria's rose. I couldn't draw a perfect woman, but I could draw Maria's women, the way I saw the world. And that's what I want people in my classes to do. To find the world that they see, to describe the world that they see through their eyes, not through the eyes of Longfellow or E. Cummings or Amy Lowell or Keats or Shelley or Yeats, although they have to read those to be able to write, but to find the words that their people speak, to write the poems for the people who are their people.
At the age of 40 or around 40, you decided to reclaim the Mazziotti name.
Right, and that's why. Mm-hmm. Because all of a sudden I thought, I cannot continue to be ashamed of my name. I cannot continue to be ashamed of being what I am. An Italian American, daughter of working class and lower working class immigrants, citizen of Paterson, New Jersey. So, you know, that's what I needed to be. a citizen of America, a citizen of what made America great, all the immigrants who came here and gave their lifeblood to this country.
Mrs. Gillan, I would like to thank you for being with us today, and I would like to let the listeners know that Mrs. Maria Mazziotti Gillan's website is mariagillan.com, Gillan, Gillan. For those who are very young poets and dream of becoming one day Maria Mazziotti Gillan, well, their own version.
They want to be poets.
Do you have a few words of encouragement?
Yes, my don't give up. One of the things about this, as I've been doing it, is that I've seen a lot of people say, I want to be a poet. And if they're not famous in 3.5 days, they give up. Never give up. Write every day and read as much as you can. Read the newspaper, read tomato cans, read poetry, read novels, read anything you can get your hands on. Get the language into your body and into your blood, and write about what you see around you.
Thank you so much. And I wish you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.